Greetings, everyone. My name is Steve Miller, Program Director of Minnesota Independent Scholars Forum, and I welcome you to our program for today. We're meeting here at Maplewood Library because of early voting. Our normal location in the Shoreview Library has been taken over by democracy. Fortunately, democracy will go away, so that shouldn't be a problem in the future. Anyway, Minnesota Independent Scholars Forum is a group which sort of goes for those who are interested in learning and knowledge, who don't fit into any of the standard pegs. They may be academics, they may not, but what they do share is an interest in finding out about things of a diverse and unbounded nature. So anything you're interested in, our group is interested into. We do programs once a month, at least 9 months of the year. Next month, we will be having a program called Family Declassified, about a woman's search for the roots of her family in Eastern Europe. They'll be presented on a screen by Zoom, so it should be a new experience for us. In January, we will have Accidental Hero, about a person who finds out he's liberated a village that his family comes from in the Czech Republic, and the search that goes on from there. In February, we will deal with chaos and complexity theory, which may explain a lot of what's happening today. In March, we will do art in Minnesota, about the artistic heritage of Minnesota, which is more extensive than you may realize. And basically each month, usually on the fourth Saturday, we have a Saturday morning program here. We also have a website, minindependentscholars.com, .org, which tells about our activities, and is a good way to catch up on what we're doing. We have a journal which comes out twice a year, with one hopefully coming out very soon. We also have groups. Right now, our main group is discussing philosophy, and next month we will be discussing Friedrich Nietzsche's The Genealogy of Morals, which Nietzsche is always an interesting figure, so should be. It's usually, these are done by Meetup online, and then we also have the ability to be the overseer of grants and financial donations, etc. If you find someone who's willing to give you money to do a research project, but they say there's one big catch, you have to have a responsible adult to make sure you're spending the money the way it's supposed to be spent. We have in our organization responsible adults, and we've done a number of projects. One on Vietnam Raiders, people who protested the war. Done projects on Duluth Memorial Hospital for unwed mothers, and have done one on sort of mapping prejudice in Minnesota, redlining, etc. And we even put together our own book. We have a book, Scholars Without Walls, which tells about our organization and what we do, how it came about, gives our background. But normally I have found people do not want to hear me make my blatant pitch for money. Membership in our organization is only $25 a year for an individual, $30 for family, and then higher levels. And if you give a presentation to us, we'll give you a 1-year complimentary membership. Which, since I need someone to do a program in April, anyone who has anything on tap, just let me know. But I will turn this over to our presenters. Becca Brackett is a retired doctor, president of a local co-housing project, Cedar Co-Housing LLC. And the project wants to be for all generations and locate in an area urban enough for good transit with amenities within walking distance. And they're trying to build energy efficient buildings with about 30 households. So if you're thinking about where you want to live, this is an idea. And Lynn England currently serves as treasurer of Twin Cities Co-Housing Network. She has had a lifelong interest in the formation of intentional communities. She's a founder of Hearth Communities, a group of families and single adults who, despite not living together, declared themselves to be an intentional community over 30 years ago. So if you are wondering about this program, or you're interested in it already and want to learn more, this is your chance. So I turn the program over to our speaker.
Steve.
Will not run off with technology.
Well, I guess the question is, do I need amplification? There's people in the back, would you like me?
They're recording, so you.
No, I mean for the other microphone that does amplify. Do you need some help hearing back there?
So, yeah, our topic today is living in intentional community and the appeal of a co-housing method. Next. Well, he's already kind of introduced us. I'm the secretary of the organization TCCN, which is Twin Cities Co-Housing Network, and we're also known as Co-Housing Minnesota because there aren't many in their state. So in my free time, I like to do quilting, and Lynn likes to do knitting. And Lynn, do you want to say a little more about the philosophy camp?
And I just add that I was an instructor for a course at the University of Minnesota that was known as Philosophy Camp. The actual name was a philosophy course called Lives Worth Living, Self-Vocation and Community. And it was a residential course taught at a retreat center out near Windham, Minnesota. It was 3 weeks long, and the students came not knowing each other, and we built an intentional community on the spot that lasted for 3 weeks. It's a very powerful learning experience, and instead of talking about philosophy of the philosophers and studying that, we talked about our own philosophies, given our lived experience and personal stories.
So briefly, what is co-housing? Well, it's an alternative housing model with full featured private homes and shared spaces designed for social connection. And the development model is that people come together at the beginning and are developing their relationships and form a group, and then they find some land to build on. They hire builders or a developer to create the buildings for them to move into. And then they buy them individual units, just as, you know, your neighbor down the street in the single family home buys it with a mortgage. Next. So it's a special type of intentional community. Other types of intentional community, you might see religious groups such as a monastery, which is a defined, you know, group, and they're there for a religious reason. And every time we bring this up, people think of communes and hippies, but we're not any of those kind of things. We are formed by a group of people who have chosen to live together and work cooperatively to reflect their shared values. And many times those values are ecological, lighting, you know, reducing your carbon footprint, and being close and helpful to your neighbors. Next. So the future residents hold this co-housing dream, and working together with their common spaces, they typically have several meals a week together. Although they have their own kitchen, they can just cook at home if they want to. But it's designed with the residents involved in the process. And in this book is kind of one of the original books. And as you can see, between these houses, which are much closer than my, you know, North Minneapolis neighborhood, there's only a walkway in between them. rather than a street. So that way you can look across and see how your neighbor is doing in the morning when they pick up their paper. And now I want to show you 3 examples of co-housing communities. This one is called Arboretum. It's in Madison, Wisconsin. It's very close to the famous Arboretum that the University of Wisconsin has, where they have prairie as well as, trees. So that's where they took their name. This block was originally owned by a hospital that's nearby, and there were a bunch of rundown houses. And the hospital wanted to add something, I don't know, an MRI, they wanted a new wing somewhere. And the residents said, no, you're not gonna get permission from us to do this other thing unless you clean up your block, because it was full of students and late night parties, and the other neighbors were sick of it. So then the co-housing group bought it. They kept some of the single family homes, and then they built 2 of these more like apartment style. And it's on a slope, and this is the back side. The other view was the front. And this side, their dining room opens like a walkout basement. So it's a common area where then they can go outside and the children can play out there. And it is 40 individual units, 40 households, you might say. And it's all generations, they have children. And so that's the story on Arboretum. Next. This now is a senior community. Some co-housers choose to follow that federal rule of you can declare your community only people 55 and older to live there. If you didn't declare that with the federal rule, you'd be discriminating. But since they made this federal rule that seniors can choose to just live together with no youngins around. And this is another university town, evidently Stillwater, Oklahoma. And again, you see the walkway in between the homes, and there's single level homes, which is suitable for seniors who start to have trouble with the stairs. Originally, and this is like their common house. The common house is where that dining room and kitchen happen. It originally was a single family house on this entire lot, and they adapted it to be their common house. And the people originally were working, they were still working. They were 55, but they were still working. So they had a different kind of view, but this is their layout. In the center, you see the common house. And if this was the original house and that was the original driveway, then they put all the garages over there, and the rest of it is all by walkways connecting. And usually these communities have like utility carts and helpful neighbors who can bring your groceries or whatever you need from your parking car over to your living unit. And the third one is a very urban area in Seattle, Washington called Capitol Hill. I assume that means it's actually close to their capital, but I can't swear to it. But it's the white part of there, and there's a little sliver of yellow in the back, and that is the co-housing community. And there's only 9 units. It's designed by the architect Grace Kim. And if you like TED Talks, you need to look up Grace Kim's TED Talk on co-housing because it's fantastic. She is just great. Her architectural office is on the first floor, and then the other units are above it. Next. And this is inside. They have this little tiny patio with these balconies, you might say, and walkways, and you can look across to the other unit and see your neighbor right over there. So, and then they have their one level, they have their dining hall, but their dining hall is much, much smaller than some of the others because they only have 9 units. But she has studied how people interact with each other and what allows people to have that sense of community. So now, having seen some of these examples, I'm going to turn it to Lynn to talk more about those social aspects.
Thanks, Becca. One of the things we know from research is that co-housing tends to reduce the risk of social isolation. And this is a big deal. Social isolation is now a national health concern. It is about people of all ages are affected by social isolation. And we're really trying to figure out how to reduce that risk. We know that especially for seniors who are in single-family homes, once they become alone and isolated, it's very hard for them to create new connections. One of the things that co-housing, people interested in co-housing want is a life that works for everybody. So they're imagining a type of living arrangement and a society that is better than what we have available right now. They're looking for a new way of creating housing models, a new way of living together. They want to express their highest values together within their community. And in that way, they become culture creators. And this has been true of all intentional communities throughout history. So the Shakers, were another example of an intentional community. They all had a core set of values. People who believed in those values were coming together to live out their best lives. And in that way, they can begin to change society. So co-housing is relatively new. It was started in Denmark in the 1970s, came to the US in the 90s. So it's still an emerging model of housing and cooperation. Co-housing appeals to older adults because the boomers can imagine new opportunities for meaning and purpose in their lives. They can extend their household assets by sharing more resources. So they can get rid of a lot of things in their single family home, downsize. They don't need the lawnmower because they only need one lawnmower in a co-housing community, right? The large turkey roaster that you've had for 35 years, that can go in the common kitchen and you'll probably only need one or two of those. It allows opportunities for greater friendships because co-housing communities are designed for people to run into each other just during the natural part of the day. And it allows for greater independence. So many seniors have knee replacements or hip replacements and they need a little bit of care for a short time. They might need someone to make them a meal or pick up their mail or go get a prescription. And in co-housing, it's very easy to coordinate those things in a very simple way. Younger families can really benefit from co-housing because they're sharing all those spaces and they're sharing workloads. So they don't have to manage maintaining their own home. They have connections with older people. So if their family, if grandparents aren't available, they've got older people in the community that can look after children, that can build relationship with their kids. There's an opportunity for tremendous transfer of skills between generations as people work together. Of course, there's playmates for children. Sometimes co-housing communities have a pack of kids ranging in age from, preschools to high school. They play together and take care of each other. And there's parenting support for the parents. But to live in co-housing requires effective group process skills and mastering the art of nonviolent communication. So you can't go around being angry and yelling at people all the time. It just isn't going to work. But if groups become effective because they've practiced these skills, excuse me, that helps all people reach their potential, meet their needs, feel validated and heard. And the important thing is when it comes to making decisions, the decision-making goes more smoothly because they've built up trust with each other and they understand the outcomes. Becca.
One thing I remember that I wanted to include was that when COVID hit, that whole idea of all getting together for a meal, you couldn't do that, but they were resilient and many of them several people would cook together and then they would deliver meals to people's doorstep. And then others, remember those COVID checks from Uncle Sam? Well, if you already had sufficient income, like my pension and my Social Security and some money in the bank, I didn't need the COVID check. Well, in some of these communities, they set up a fund so that people who felt, well, I don't really need this extra check would go into the fund, and the people who maybe were gig workers or something else where they were totally out of income, that allowed them to at least pay for their groceries or pay their homeowner's fee, because there is, as like a condo situation, there are association fees to cover the insurance on the complex, etc.
Most co-housing communities are self-managed and self-governed, and that means everyone makes decisions together. It's not just a small group of people that makes decisions for the majority. There are two major ways.
Excuse me, is there any provision when you join these for, say somebody is really undesirable? Does the association have the power to tell that person, to make them sell their place and leave?
Not usually. It's not usually legal to tell somebody they have to sell their house, right?
That's what I'm
Because
saying.
they own
I
their
wonder
own
if they
house.
have some extra.
But what happens in co-housing communities is people who really can't get along in the community recognize they're not a good fit and they leave on their own, right? Yeah, that's usually what happens. There are cases where people have, mental health issues, or there are other complications or very challenging personalities that people need to learn how to work through. And that's why they say co-housing is like the best therapy, for human development that you could provide, because it's everyday situations where you're learning how to get along with people. So it's challenging to make decisions together. People don't agree. Just because you agree to live together in co-housing doesn't mean you will all agree on everything, especially things like pet policies and
The color of the walls.
yeah, the color of the walls and how children should be raised. But if you're using a consensus process, you focus on what is the good, the best for the group, and until everyone agrees. The difficulty with using a pure consensus process is usually one person can veto it and say, I just don't agree, and then you can't move forward. There's no way to move forward until everybody agrees, and so it can take a very long time to reach full consensus. Of course, that's a model that the Quakers have used for a long time, and in many situations, waiting a long time until everyone agrees works. If you're trying to decide what color to paint a room, it doesn't work so well. Excuse me. So another model that has become popular is a consent object model. We call it sociocracy. There are other names for it, like dynamic democracy. It means working with people's objections to a particular proposal until the proposal is improved enough or modified enough so that everyone is willing to say, okay, it's good enough for now. We'll give it a try. It often means saying, well, it's good enough to try for 6 weeks or 6 months, but then I want this thing reviewed because I want to know how it's actually working. And so that's a way to get things going more quickly with the ability to revise and improve. So it's a constant learning model, and it can be quite difficult to learn how to use either of these models, but when they are effectively used in a community, it really speeds things along. Co-housing, as I said earlier, can influence society and the greater community. I think people who live in co-housing wish there was more of it available, that we want it to be a normal housing model that people could choose, not just for rich white folks who can afford to put up all the money, buy the land, build the thing. We want it available for everybody, because it's a new model of living in a community life. It helps us share resources, reduce our carbon footprint. It can help us break down barriers because we get to know each other better. So we might not all be the same. We might have extreme differences, but when we live with each other and learn to listen, then we can break down barriers. Co-housing residents are also much more likely to be involved in the local civic life of the community than others. So they vote more, they participate more in council meetings, city meetings, whatever. They almost all want to create housing that has a lighter carbon footprint. So they're looking to build net zero houses or to use low VOC materials in their building. Of course, they're limited by their budget, everybody is, but they do the best they can. They have a sustainability focus, so they're looking to build in recycling and the other natural ways of becoming more sustainable. And they also work to meet needs in the community.
On the clustering, if they're more in a rural or suburban area, clustering
the houses in one area. And so having wide open spaces around them for wildlife, and walking and tours and so on. So in suburbs, some of them say, well, you have to have a 1 acre lot per house. Well, you know, that's wasteful. That means more driveways and more, you know, infrastructure. So clustering them is much more efficient and improves the neighborhood.
Yeah, right. So one of the ways of achieving greater efficiency is by having townhomes or apartment type units, because you have shared common walls. So it reduces construction costs and it increases efficiency. If you're a co-housing resident, a day in the life of co-housing might be that you share an idea with someone you meet on the path, and you might talk about it or just mention something that'll come up in a meeting later. You might be carpooling or doing something else. It might be your turn to take the kids to daycare. You might just ask a neighbor for something that you ran out of, some milk or a cup of sugar. In Stillwater, Oklahoma, the Oak Creek Co-housing has a happy hour in the Commons every day after work. And you don't have to have an alcoholic beverage, but everybody tends to meet there after work. Cooking a common meal with others can be a real community building idea. I visited a co-housing community in Denmark that had shared common meals 6 days a week, and the families with very young children loved it because the meals were kid friendly. They didn't have to do anything for those meals except show up on time, say they were coming. They could even bring their own takeout containers and eat at home if they wanted. And it was so much more cost effective for feeding a family. They only had to cook once every 6 weeks in that community, and they cooked for three days in rotations. So, but it can work really well. In the US, we tend to have common meals about twice a week. And you might also serve on a committee, a garden maintenance committee, for example, shown here. To do all these things, co-housing requires clear expectations. And this is another thing. These need to be worked out by everybody in the community. Everybody has to come to consensus on items such as, what is the work requirement? You own a single family home, you know who's responsible for cutting the grass. It's you. You know, you live in co-housing and you wish somebody else would do that. Well, if someone loves cutting the grass, that's great. You might be the person who, you know, does the vacuuming, right? Or clean up the common house or empty the dishwasher. So, but what is that work requirement? Is it noted? Is it like 4 hours a month? Or, you know, attend a couple of work parties each year? How is it adjusted for your abilities and your interests? Does everybody have to do exactly the same thing? That isn't going to work very well in a multi-generational community. And can you pay to get out of it? What if you get a sabbatical, or you go to Europe for 6 months, or you're a snowbird, you live in another state? How do you get out of your work requirement? Can you pay? How much do you have to pay? You know, or can you make it up? Can you bank hours if you do more than needed? And then how is that work requirement tracked and recorded? Who's in charge of that? Do you just do it? Is it a trust system, or is there some other way of doing it? So there aren't any specific answers to any of this. Every community has to figure it out on their own.
When you use the word consensus there, does that mean majority rule or?
No, it
complete
means
consensus?
everybody has to agree. Everybody agrees. It's usually sent to a committee to work on and then presented as a proposal. Another thing that's different in a co-housing community is the nature of the transactions. So we're very used to direct reciprocity transactions, transactional exchanges, where I go to a coffee shop, here's my barista, you know, he gives me a cup of coffee, I give him my money, right? We know how to do that. What we're not so good at is understanding generalized transactions where there's indirect reciprocity. So I experienced this with my Hearth Communities group. My husband at the time and I and our daughter were moving from the Western metro area into Golden Valley. And we had a lot of stuff to move, including pianos and a lot of woodworking stuff and, you know, everything that kids and families have. And we thought, well, the right way to do it at this stage in our life is hire a professional moving company, right? You just pay. You don't ask your friends to do it unless you're like a college student or a, poor graduate student or something. But our community encouraged us to make the invitation and say, anybody's welcome to help move. Don't do anything more than you're able to do. If you have bad back, you don't help carry the piano up from the basement, right? And amazingly, we provided the moving van and people did what they could. And in one day, we started early in the morning. By dinner time, everything was moved out of our old house and into our new house. And my community knew us so well and we trusted each other so much that I was comfortable letting people set up my kitchen, setting up my bedroom, putting the sheets on the bed. I mean, they kind of knew where things were anyway, why not? And of course I changed a few things later, but it was a wonderful experience for us to trust. It took a leap of faith to trust that we could do that. And the community in exchange, we didn't feel that we owed every single person who helped us something. We had committed to the community and contributed something. They contributed to us. We contributed to the community in other ways, like by founding it and organizing a lot of events. So the appeal of living in co-housing is really the ideal of a life that works for everybody. A feeling of belonging, of being known for who you want to be known, how you want to be known. Learning deeper cooperation with others, and the ideal of providing service to the greater community.
Yes, and I was going to say that question of the majority rule. In electing our congressman or whatever, there's so many votes, so many people involved. It wouldn't be practical to get everyone to agree. But in a co-housing community, which might only have 20 households, if you go with 50% plus one, that means 49% are unhappy. They didn't like the decision. And in a small group like that, that doesn't lead to a good ongoing sense of the community. So that's why they have these ways to try to get agreement, or at least no objection. I don't like the red wall, but go ahead. It's not going to hurt me that much.
How are these units or organizations generally formed? Do people get their friends to join with them, or do people just go in and take their chances that they're going to get along with everybody?
Well, I'm sure a lot of them were started by friends. That particularly I would recently visit in Iowa City and met with them and how they did their development. And they said that the 5 original members knew each other through the food co-ops. So they already had known each other and worked together on projects in the food co-ops. And then they started their idea of doing a co-housing. But now there is a national organization, Cohousing USA, and they have a website and they have a directory of, there's more than 160 communities. So some people go and just join one that's already there, so some people do have to, they don't live there forever. They may have to move for a job, or they may get old and disabled and actually have to go into
Is there an interview process?
Well, most of them are condos. Some of them are co-ops, and co-ops actually have more control over who moves in. A condo, officially, legally, you can sell it to whoever you want to. But in co-housing, there's people who are invited sometimes to those common dinners, and they really like the idea, but there's no vacancy. And then when Mr. Henry decides to move, they have kind of a list of people who have been wannabe, and then they, call them and say, hey, do you want to look at this place? Here's the price. So there are some that do have relationships with some low income mechanism. One of them in Madison called Linden, but took much longer to develop because they had to get along with the housing authority as well as the city planning. And, there was a lot of steps to participate in any government program. There's a lot of steps. So if you're totally on the private market, there's fewer steps, but you have to have more money. And you had a question.
Yes, I was just trying to process what I was gonna say. As a person living with MI and disability, other than living with my mother, like God forbid if she died today, and if I were to live in a Co-housing network house, how do I get supports, like companion and stuff? Like if somebody were to support me with the cooking or anything sort of like that.
Well,
Other than
actually,
your neighbors,
yeah,
your
well, your
neighbors will
neighbors,
help, right?
you know, it's amazing how supportive they are. There was
Oh, good.
one community in which a lady who was already like 85 or something moved in, and her daughters, her children told her, well, get your unit right close to the parking lot so you can get in your car and go somewhere. But after a couple of years, a unit opened up much closer to the common house where, you know, your mail, your meal, your sociability, your music room. She wanted to move closer to the middle, so she moved from the edge to the middle, so she could see people more often and had support. And so there's a lot of support, but sometimes it comes to it, and there are some people who have formed a nonprofit and are trying to develop a co-housing that includes neurodiverse people who do have needs for, you know, safety and different things. Evidently, they say they have to limit the number of individuals who are on that SSI or anything like that, because if they have too many of them, then they're considered a group home, and then there's a whole slug of regulations. So,
Some co-housing communities, one I visited, it was Stillwater, Oklahoma, actually. One family had built a 2-bedroom unit, and the second bedroom was in like almost a separate unit. And they had a helper live there and provide assistance for them in that unit. Some co-housing communities, especially senior co-housing communities, provide like a family room suite as a guest room, and they have that available so that if I had a hip replacement, I could have my family come and visit and stay for a week and help me during that time. But the ongoing needs for assistance can be problematic for a community, and you would have to arrange for outside help to come in. Unless some senior communities hire someone to come in and provide services for everyone in the community. You know, it just depends on what the community needs. It's sometimes challenging. I've read of someone who had severe allergies, and it just didn't work for them to live in a co-housing community. The community just couldn't provide adequate safety. Yes.
I'm wondering about that, because I've got severe allergies and I'm sensitive to chemicals. Things like insecticide, herbicide, things like that.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, we can't hear the question.
Yeah, how to deal with severe allergies like pesticides and chemical sensitivities. That might be something that a co-housing community could address, because they're very often interested in using, you know, less harsh chemicals, no pesticides on the lawn. And the community as a whole might be able to deal with that. But it's a challenge. Food allergies are another issue that's, you know, challenging for a community to deal with. They often can deal with a variety of dietary concerns by the way they make their meals and share them. A lot of food bars, you know, like a taco bar or a salad bar or something like that. People can choose what it is that they can eat. A variety of different toppings and dressings allows for a variety of dietary needs. Other questions?
I guess, you know, this is being a lawyer. What sort of the legal framework you have for a co-housing network? I mean, I know homeowners associations, condominium associations, assisted living, even leases for apartments. What kind of, are there documents you have to sign, or is there, you know, what's the structure?
Sure. Well, Twin Cities Co-housing Network is a 501c3 nonprofit. So we're an educational organization. We don't develop co-housing. We just give presentations and hope to encourage people in that direction. I'll let Becca talk about the other half.
Well, my group has formed an LLC as, you know, in its essence, development side of things. And we would expect that we will be a condominium when we get built. And there's no need for some special zoning for co-housing because we're either single-family homes even, we are townhomes, we're apartment buildings, or condo building. There's no special zoning needed for co-housing. Now, within the community, if it's a condo under the state of law, you have to follow the state laws, whatever they apply in that realm. Then within the community, there may be, agreements, no dogs in the common house. You can have the dog outside, but not in the common house, or, things like that. So they make up their own rules. And just like any association, some people don't always follow the rules, but, it's people, you have to try to get along and deal with things as they come up. Does that answer?
Yeah, I guess one other question, because some of these communities seem to involve single family dwellings. Is there a situation where people sort of say, I'm in the co-housing community for a while, but I just realized my home is my castle, I don't want people coming in or things like that, and they can say, I'm out. Is that possible?
Well, each housing unit is your castle, so you have your full, everything that you need within your own unit, whether it's an apartment or a house. And there, there's times when people kind of seem to drop out of sight and don't participate. And again, that can happen in the neighborhood. You see things on the news, like the one guy shot the other one, he'd been harassing him for months. And by knowing each other ahead of time, that tends to reduce that kind of friction. But it can develop, that's true. And in terms of reselling a unit in a condo, technically you can sell it to anyone, but if they have like a waiting list of people who have already been coming to a meeting, they came to an event, the Arboretum Co-housing has loaned out their big room for a blood drive. And there was a family nearby where their daughter was turning 15 and they were of Latino descent, and they had to have a quinceañera, which is a really big party, and they had it over at the Common House. Fred?
You mentioned it earlier, but you could be organized as a co-op. Not many are in the US, but it could be. And it could even be a limited equity co-op, which helps a lot with long-term affordability.
He was mentioning a limited equity cooperative in which you agree ahead of time that you're not going to follow the ups and downs of the market in terms of, gee, the market's really hot, I can double the price of what I paid on my house. No, there's a formula that, lets you, the price go up according to the general inflation, so that when you sell, the next person is, not faced a humongous increase in price.
Yes,
Let's say, tell me what the low income units in co-housing? You said there are some.
yeah, that's a good question. What about low income units in co-housing? Very, very difficult to achieve right now because co-housing is an emerging model, and we don't have in place very many ways to include market rate units and low income units in a co-op, in a condominium type association. So it has been done in a few places. It's very complicated to work out financially. Excuse me. Yeah, Becca.
Well, one of them in, I think, Boulder, Colorado, they originally built fairly large single-family homes, and they were on a slope, so they did have walkout basements. But originally, they were a couple with children, and they used all the space that they had. Then when the children moved out, they had a lot of extra room, and they converted their walkout basements into apartments, and they rented them. And that's definitely less expensive than buying a house. So there sometimes are situations in which it wasn't originally rental, but it becomes rental.
So that it's You don't necessarily have to buy it, someone actually put it in these low, if there are low income places, they might actually be prevented as opposed to.
That's right. If it's low income, it's probably a rental unit instead of a home ownership unit. And we're working to develop more lower income home ownership units in the state of Minnesota, but getting those laws focused on co-housing, I think that's a long way away yet. Although we keep working on it. Yes.
You're talking about it could be an apartment or it could be a single family home. How do taxes relate?
Well, in a condominium association, you own your own home. It's homesteaded, so you have the homestead tax
Whether
credit.
If it's an apartment type building?
Even if it's an apartment type building, a condominium, I live in a 67 unit condominium building. So I own my own home, I have my own kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, everything's mine. And then I also pay a monthly association fee to cover the costs of maintaining the common spaces. Excuse me. Many co-housing groups would like to be cooperatives, but it's very hard to get financing to build a cooperative unless you're maybe a senior cooperative. Minnesota has a lot of senior cooperatives like Applewood Point, that kind of thing for 55 plus people. They're run as a cooperative where there's an elected board of directors who makes the decisions. And usually the developer has final say over all of that. So it's not really co-housing. You could be active on committees, but you're not truly managing an Applewood Point community on your own with your other neighbors. So some people say the best way to get into co-housing is to go look for co-housing communities that have a unit for sale and go move. That's the fastest way.
I'm gonna ask you about that, there are places with, units for sale.
You know, it depends on the region. They tend to be more expensive if you're comparing square feet of the units. So, for example, a 780 square foot, 1-bedroom unit might sell for $550,000, but it might also include access to the common house and to gardens and to, acres of green space, depending on the community. So people have to be willing to focus on using the common space, not just retreating into their private space. One of the couples at Capitol Hill Urban Co-housing lives in I think it's a 680 square foot unit. And they have a big dog. It's a tiny, tiny unit and they just love it because they're never there. They sleep there, but they're out in the community. Capitol Hill is a very walkable part of Seattle. And there's a lot of restaurants and a lot of activities and parks and they're on transportation lines. And so this couple just lives their life. They've got bicycles, they bike all over, they just love it. And then they're not putting so much money into that individual housing unit.
And the groups have different interests or focuses. There was one that during development, they kept telling Charles Durrett, the architect, well, we're dancers and we go every week to the dances and this and that. So we want to have dances at our place. He didn't really believe that that was their core value, but it turned out after the day that they moved in, they had their dinner, they cleared away the stuff and on with the music and on with the dancing. So they meant it. They built it the way they needed to fulfill their lifestyle.
Earlier there was a,
You couldn't have bought that, they didn't, each individual couldn't have had this huge dance floor, but as a group, they could.
See,
yes.
So what you're saying is, other than going out as a special needs person, you're saying that they also host activities too for all ages, or is it just like for adults and then not children, but just seniors and people with special needs together, or is it just
It would depend on the community.
Oh, okay.
Completely depend on the individual community.
I don't want to live in a housing, like group housing, and all of a sudden I'm bored and I have like nothing to do. So I just thought I'd ask.
Yeah. Most co-housing communities are started by a couple of friends who have common interests. So for example, there were 2 teachers who really wanted to live in co-housing. They were teaching in a very wealthy district and they couldn't afford to live in their district. And they wanted a solution to this and they thought co-housing would be great. And they were able to get together a group of people and they hired Chuck Durrett as their architect and consultant to help them do it. And then they, you know, advertised and held events and invited people to come learn about it, and they got their co-housing built. And it was, you know, not as elaborate as some other co-housing communities, but it really worked for them. Other communities are started, they've got friends with skills, there's a lawyer, there's a banker, and there's somebody who worked in the housing industry. Guess what? They got Arboretum Co-housing built in Madison. You know, it was that right set of friends with the right skills that could really drive that forward.
And the money.
And the bankroll, that's exactly right. Yep, one group in Bainbridge Island has found the perfect site. It came up very suddenly. They had 24 hours to get it. They needed $750,000, and one guy said, "Sure, I can give that to you." You know, most of us can't do that. So it's a lot harder to get co-housing off the ground because it's not supported by municipalities. It's not considered a form of housing that people want to build, and it's not, well, like.
Do you have the bibliography?
We do have our bibliography, yes. There's a two-sided handout on the table back there by Co-housing Resources. Pick up a copy. A lot of the journal articles are, you know, some of them are open access articles, so you might be able to find some of them, maybe half of them. The others, unless you have university access or something, you probably won't be able to get to. But then there are other resources also. And Becca wants to talk about Tomo.
Yeah, in Vancouver, Canada, a group decided to have the group make a deal with a developer, and he would design the individual units, and they would have the input in designing the common areas. And they did a study. They hooked up with an organization called Happy Cities. And Happy Cities has the research facilities. And so what they did was they wanted to find out, how do people feel connected to others before they move into co-housing and after? So after the thing was built and they had, you know, they knew who was going to move in, they surveyed them. Do you have how many close friends do you have? Or how, is there someone near you who you would ask for that cup of sugar that you needed or whatever? So they asked, you know, what their social connections were. And then after the move-in, they asked again, and it shows that people felt much more satisfied. They had people they could count on, people that they could ask for help. It made a big difference, and you know, that's pretty amazing.
It seems like if you wanted to join one of these co-housing groups, it would take a fair amount of searching and intensive searching to see which one. I mean, because they differ in their.
That's right.
Obviously.
Yes.
And that would be a much harder decision than just, you know, buying a house somewhere where you're separated from people by several hundred feet and you probably never talk to them hardly. You know, but these people you have to get along with.
That's right. So they recommend that you come visit multiple times, that you sit in on meetings, you know, that you come to the common dinners. There's most co-housing communities in existence maintain that kind of outreach to people to make sure they're drawing the right people to their community. Like one guy came to a co-housing group that was forming, or he wanted to buy a unit in it. And he said, well, you know, I just don't think I can go along with that cooking common meals. I'm not a cook. And the woman, the host, she just put her arm around him and walked him to the door and said, well, you know, there's a lot of places you can live where you don't have to cook. This isn't the place for you. And so there's.
Did they communicate one with the other, that these different co-housing networks, to realize their differences, and so they can advise people that maybe it's not here for you, or maybe you should go over here?
Well, you know, they tend to be located on the coast, East Coast and West Coast. So there's a lot more choices there and there. In the Midwest, it's pretty sparse. We've got Monterey Co-housing Community in St. Louis Park. It's been in existence for 25 years. So you can get a taste of that community by visiting, by attending one of their dinners. But that's a taste of their community, right? Yes, Bruce.
How many communities are there in the Twin Cities?
There's Monterey Co-housing Community.
That's it.
That's it in the Twin Cities.
Otherwise, they're just quote, interested group, they're trying.
That's right. Many groups have tried to form. I tried to form a group. We met for, I don't know, a dozen times. We had a lot of interest. We said, we agreed on all of our values. We wanted to be close to transit. When it came right down to it, half of us wanted to be close to the blue line transit, light rail, and half of us wanted to be on the green line. Well, that's a Minneapolis St. Paul kind of divide, and it split up the group. So it's really hard to get groups going. That is a really big challenge. And this doing it co-housing light, if you can find a developer to work with, then the co-housing organizers work at selling the units. They work on holding the meetings where people get together and know each other. They work on practicing listening skills, practicing talking in rounds where everybody gets a chance to talk, nobody gets interrupted. They get to practice using consensus or sociocracy decision-making models so that people have the skills as they begin to coalesce and become a stronger community to get it built. Yes, in the back.
I've got a couple of 3 questions. One of them, which you probably can't address, is a lot of people are looking at, and some of the cooperatives have done this, to keep the land in a trust and keep the building separate, because the price of the land goes up, but the price of the property depreciates, and therefore that keeps the price of the housing low. And there is at least one or more cooperatives that do have trusts. And that's another way to do this and to keep the price at a reasonable rate. The blue line question is real interesting because a lot of the people who would look at co-op housing in Minnesota, blue line, actually live in work in downtown Minneapolis for the Hennepin County, for the city and everything. And they move up to the university and they settle in the middle of low-income communities, which the blue line is supposed to serve. But actually, the community that would form co-housing are probably affiliated with government agencies or other large corporations, and that sort of changes that. Green line, not so much, but the Edina line that's coming in, yes, and that's going to segregate the community. So the question is, a lot of the co-housing that you started talking about, or cooperative co-housing in particular, the co-housing is in existing properties. In other words, you buy the first one you looked at with an architect living on the ground floor. That's basically a condominium, and that's fixed because of the buildings are all basically the same value depending on the square foot and size. But the co-housing that you're talking about on the land, that's good. It's going to have a spread of income unless you put some sort of income limits on that. Like the co-housing in Seattle versus the co-housing in Minneapolis. I mean, I'd hate to see what the difference in square foot pricing is because our son lives in Minneapolis, in Seattle, and we know what Seattle housing is like with Microsoft and all the rest of the people there. So how do you keep co-housing if you're building from the ground up? What are the restrictions on sizes of property and things like this? So, for instance, there is a building development in Florida where the developer basically has built an entire community, solar fitted, renewable energy, you know, the name of it, but the spread of the value of the properties is nowhere uniform across the edge. And the one you said where one guy can put up $750,000, somebody else probably can't even put up $7,500. So it would seem to me that cooperatives allow a larger spread of those kinds of things. But there also have been communities over here in Minneapolis along Milwaukee Avenue is not a cooperative and it's not a condominium or a co-housing, but it is a community that forms because of the neighborhood and things like this. So you've got a spread of value. So how do you deal with this when you have someone say, I can afford a $500,000 down payment on my property. I'd like to live in Seattle or I'd like to live in Vancouver, BC, not in Vancouver, Canada, because that's got the same problem that Seattle has got. It's a more reasonable place, and someone says, that's a nice piece of property, I'm compatible with everybody. My house is probably gonna be worth $500,000, $750,000. The majority of properties are probably be in the $250,000, $300,000. What about those limitations, especially if there's gonna be turnover?
Yeah, those are big questions, but using land trusts to hold the land. And, you know, there's the Minneapolis City of Lakes Land Trust and Rondo Community Land Trust that are working now on building more multifamily housing. So moving in that direction is a possibility for co-housing. If you have a developer and they build something intending it to be co-housing, you know, the architecture isn't going to solve it all. So just because you have parking off to the side, a common house space where everybody can mingle and units that are central to it, that's not going to solve the social relation problems if people don't know each other. You really have to build in a way for people to learn how to work together and get to know each other. And so, you know, as Twin Cities Co-Housing Network, we think about, well, how could we do co-housing light and help people have those experiences? So when I moved into my condominium building, I thought this is a perfect building to retrofit for co-housing because it was 67 units. And I thought if I could get 20 units interested in co-housing, we could do something interesting. And we could begin to act as if we were a co-housing community just by how we operated together. Unfortunately, it didn't work out well for a number of reasons due to our specific building, but retrofit is another possibility that might be cost effective.
Existing homes and
Maybe an industrial building, converting it to housing, maybe part of a high-rise industrial office building, a couple floors, making it co-housing, that kind of.
so you could actually take that part of the building, not buy the whole nine thing.
Well, you know, you'd be leasing then. Yeah, you'd be leasing an office building. Let's see, you had a question.
Yes, well, maybe it's partly a comment. In terms of new move-ins and over time, I live in a townhome association. And I came when the townhome association just got started. And there was a marvelous cooperation among everybody. We were self-governed and everything. But as the years passed and people moved away or passed away, the dynamics changed. The management changed to the point where now there's a management company and there's a real separation of individuals. Now, maybe the individual units get along and they may not socialize, but they're friendly and civil with each other. But so the dynamics has changed tremendously. So I would imagine that in a co-housing, that dynamics would be an important part to keep in mind. And when you bring people that have been friends for many years and you suddenly bring in strangers, how is that going to work out? So has there been any?
You know, the question, she's saying that in her building, which is not co-housing, but apartments or is a condo?
It's townhomes.
Townhomes, that the original inhabitants were sharing and working together well, and as things have changed, even the management is not as supportive. And that's where co-housing, they manage it themselves. And so they have their own, covenants, they have their own treasurer, they pay their bills, they have to have a reserve fund to fix things that are, when the roof needs to be replaced. So that because they're self-managing, they're working always on being together. And so they usually have like a quote, life committee or entertainment committee or something where they plan, some people love to give parties and know how to do it. And so those people are on the thing, getting people together for that. So because they're self-managed and because other people come to them and are attracted because of the social environment, usually as things turn over, you get more people who are still into that group thing or, that way of cooperating. And some of them have found that, when there's a co-housing condo, you can ask a realtor to sell your unit, but it doesn't work very well because the realtors are always saying, look at the marble countertop and look at the wonderful windows and look at the carpet. Whereas they're not saying anything about your neighbors and how you get along. And so usually it works better for the people who live there to kind of reach out to all their friends to say, hey, we got a unit open. Do you want to come see and buy it? So.
I think that might be a good way to begin wrapping up. It brings us back to co-housing being an intentional community. The intention is for people to want to live together and they want to get along. And that intention has to be kept alive by everyone who lives there. So one of the reasons I'm not having much luck retrofitting my condominium building is because people buy into my condominium building with the attitude, I don't have to get to know my neighbors. I can just lock the door and leave, right? Somebody else is going to take care of the snow and cutting the grass. Yeah. One last question.
Going back to this last question and some previous comments, the intentional community is intentional, whether you're Quakers, whether you are whatever your religious or social or organization. Over time, that changes. And it's probably may change given the economic situations and things that people are less mobile than they have been in the past. So the argument for co-housing where you're dealing with the real estate seems less important as the community. Therefore, a cooperative, I don't know that you have legal control over your co-housing as to who can buy into the deal. I don't think you can do that and not be.
Not unless you're a cooperative. That's right.
Okay, so the difference between a cooperatively owned building versus a co-housing owned building starts to diminish. And if with a land trust or other developments, you can keep the prices reasonable, and the real effort is not in what the buildings are once they've been established, whether they've been old buildings that you're retrofitted or new ones ground up. It has to be your ability to keep the community together as opposed to
exactly.
being
Keep the
focused so
community
hard
together.
on the buildings, and therefore the model for co-housing and cooperatives essentially emerged. I think the economics makes more sense under a cooperative measure if you've got a community that agrees to stay together and you don't have to deal with the legal situations.
Well,
dealing with the property.
remember that co-housing is not a legal structure. It's just a type of intentional community.
Right, but if it's a cooperative, like the City of Lakes cooperative and the other ones, the issue of the property becomes less of an issue as opposed to the people who want to keep the community. But there's no way you can keep the community if it's tied to the land and the control of the land, which you can't do. The cooperative has more power in terms of its legal structure. You can ask Steve about that, I guess, than a co-housing unit, which can have a lot of other business structures or economic structures and financial structures put into it. It seems you're limiting this by tying the community with the
Maybe
structure.
this is something better for talking with our
Yeah.
presenters.
We'll be willing to talk. We don't want to keep everyone
Yeah.
longer than they want to be here. So we're really glad that you came. And we do have some books and so on in the back, and there's a place to sign up if you would like to get on our newsletter for the Twin Cities Co-housing, to get on the newsletter for the Co-housing Network. So I really think that maybe we should wrap up, and if there's individual questions, we'll stay and talk with that. Paul, I know, Paul is also involved with the TCCN.
Becca, do you want to talk about how people can learn more about Cedar Co-housing, the effort you're a part of?
Well, I do have our brochure in the back for Cedar Co-housing, which is an individual project, people who have decided they're going to build one in the Twin Cities. They're working on it.
What do you mean by in the Twin Cities? I mean, you're talking like.
Ask me later, ask me after. Well, excuse the crowd.
Discuss with our presenters and to enjoy our treats, so I don't have to take them all.